For decades, the red earth of Burkina Faso has bled gold. Millions of ounces, refined to a mirror finish, flowing steadily into the cold vaults of Sydney, London, and Toronto. It is a staggering paradox that defines our modern world. A land so wealthy it could pave its roads in yellow metal, yet its children have long walked barefoot on dust. The fourth largest gold producer on the continent, yet one of the poorest nations on God's green earth. This was not an accident of geography. It was a masterpiece of design. A system where the risk was African, but the reward was always foreign. But in the heart of Ouagadougou, a silence has been broken. A young captain in a camouflage uniform, Ibrahim Traore, sat across from the titans of the global mining empire, and he did not ask for a seat at the table. He redefined the table itself. He spoke a language the boardrooms of Australia were not prepared to hear. He spoke of African resource sovereignty. He spoke of a day when the gold of the Sahel would finally stay in the Sahel. This is the interview the world wasn't ready for, and the revolution they can no longer ignore. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map of our ancestors. If this story resonates with your sense of justice, do not leave. Give us your love, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the Sahel Doctrine to continue this journey together. We are not just sharing news, we are keeping the flame of dignity burning for the entire African diaspora. Before a single drill bit touches the stone, the story is always about risk. For years, the narrative was simple. Africa has the resources, but the West has the capital. The West has the technology. Therefore, the West must take the lion's share. This was the foundation of the Kiaka gold mine. It followed a path we have seen 1,000 times in Black history. A foreign company, West African Resources Limited, backed by external investors, took the lead. The government was handed a modest 15% stake, a symbolic seat in a room where they had no real voice. At that stage, the arrangement was sold as a necessity. The project was a gamble. The earth might be empty. The costs might spiral. The uncertainty justified the extraction of wealth. But then came 2025. The drills stopped searching and started finding. The projections turned into cold, hard data. Kiaka wasn't just a mine. It was a fountain of wealth, expected to produce nearly 300,000 ounces of gold every single year. Suddenly, the risk that had been used to justify the lopsided ownership began to evaporate. The system was working. The gold was flowing. And that is the exact moment when the young captain stepped into the light. Ibrahim Traore understood a fundamental truth that many leaders before him chose to forget. A resource that physically exists within your borders is the ultimate leverage. When the mine reached stability, when the output became a mathematical certainty, he did not wait for the contracts to expire in 20 years. He moved with the precision of a soldier and the foresight of a statesman. He looked at the numbers and realized that every percentage of ownership leaving the country was a school not built, a hospital not equipped, a future stolen. The move to increase the state's stake from 15% to a staggering 40% was more than a policy shift. It was the Sahel gold revolution in motion. It was a declaration that the era of charity and aid was dead, replaced by the era of ownership and pride. Imagine the scene in the boardrooms of Perth and Sydney. For years, they had viewed the Sahel through a lens of paternalism, a place to be managed, a place to be harvested. They were prepared for a leader they could negotiate with in the shadows. They were not prepared for a man who stood on the world stage and demanded dignity and liberation for his people's assets. This was the collision point. On one side, the old guard of the global mining empire clinging to the fine print of neo-colonial contracts. On the other, a new generation of Africa rising, holding a pen that was no longer dipped in the ink of desperation, but in the blood of sovereignty. The world watched, breathless, as the power dynamic shifted in a single afternoon. The empire thought they were dealing with a client. They realized, too late, they were dealing with a landlord. When the news hit the wires, the reaction was instantaneous. This wasn't just another African country asking for a bigger slice of the pie. This was a fundamental restructuring of the global order. The markets did not just react, they froze. The very foundation of how the West interacts with African wealth began to tremble. Why did the certainty of success suddenly lead to a crisis of control? Because for the first time in a century, the House was no longer winning, the people were. But as the headlines began to scream about investor uncertainty and political risk, A much sharper, much more dangerous question began to echo through the corridors of power. This shift we are witnessing is not merely a change in paperwork, it is a profound reordering of the mathematics of power. To understand why this move sent shockwaves from the red dust of Ouagadougou to the glass towers of Sydney, one must look past the headlines and into the ledger. For decades, the wealth of the Sahel was treated as a ghost, something everyone knew existed, but no one could quite grasp until it was already gone. In the early days of the Kiaka project, ownership was a vague, symbolic notion. A 15% stake was a seat at a table where the language was foreign and the decisions were made elsewhere. It was a participation prize for a nation providing the very soil the gold was buried in. But as the mine transitioned from a blueprint into a beating heart of industry, the nature of that ownership changed. It stopped being a hope and became a calculation. A previous estimate, whispered in the corridors of finance, placed the value of just a 5% stake in Kiaka at over $30 million. Now, let the weight of that number settle. If 5% is $30 million, then the leap from 15% to 40% is not a minor adjustment. It is a seismic reclamation of hundreds of millions of dollars in future revenue. This is the African resource sovereignty that the world has feared. A sovereign state that no longer waits for crumbs to fall from the master's table, but instead takes its rightful place at the head of it. This is not a gamble, it is a harvest. With the mine projected to deliver between 240,000 and 280,000 ounces of gold every single year. Every percentage point reclaimed is a victory for the ancestors who watched this wealth leave in chains. The justification for the old way was always uncertainty. The investors told us that because they took the risk, they deserved the reward. They told us that the capital they brought was more valuable than the land we provided. But by 2025, that argument had crumbled like dry clay. The output was consistent. The systems were proven. The risk was dead. And in its place stood a high-output asset that was as predictable as the rising sun. This clarity is what allowed the government to act. They did not move when the mine was a dream. They moved when it was a machine. This was the genius of the 2024 mining reforms, a legal framework designed to catch the wind just as the sails were full. It was a law written not in the spirit of submission, but in the spirit of dignity and liberation. When the Australian markets woke up to this reality, the reaction was telling. West African Resources Limited did not just continue as if nothing had happened. They requested a trading halt. They stopped the clocks. Why? Not because the mine had stopped producing, not because the gold had turned to lead. The drills were still turning, and the workers were still at their posts. The halt happened because the value of the company had been fundamentally recalculated. In the world of global finance, a company is not valued by what it digs up, but by how much of that digging it actually owns. When the state announced its intention to increase its share, the future earnings projections for foreign investors didn't just dip, they were rewritten. The analysts had to go back to their screens, their models shattered by a young captain who understood the power of the pen as well as the power of the sword. This was the Sahel gold revolution revealing its true face. It was a procedural, cold-blooded reassertion of national interest. It proved that you do not need to seize a mine with force if you can master the law that governs it. The mine continues to run. The expertise of the foreign company is still utilized. The infrastructure remains in place, but the flow of the river has been diverted. Instead of a one-way stream leaving the continent, a significant portion of that wealth is now being channeled back into the parched earth of the Sahel. This is the silent war being fought in the ledgers of the world, a war where the weapons are percentages and the battlefield is the future. For the diaspora watching from across the ocean, this is the moment we have prayed for. It is the sight of an African nation standing tall, looking the global empire in the eye and saying, "The rules have changed. We are no longer the junior partner in our own destiny. We are the architects." But as the markets paused and the world held its breath, a deeper fear began to grip the hearts of those who have long profited from African instability. If Burkina Faso could do this without firing a single shot, without breaking a single machine, and without stopping the flow of gold, who else was watching? The silence of the trading floor was not a sign of peace. It was the sound of an old world dying and a new one struggling to be born. Because once the math of ownership is mastered, the chains of debt and dependency begin to snap, one by one, link by link. But as the empire began to calculate its losses, they realized that the true danger wasn't just in the gold being reclaimed. The danger lay in the precedent being set. a precedent that threatened to turn every certain investment in the Sahel into a question of who truly holds the keys to the kingdom. The reaction from the global north was as predictable as it was frantic. When the young captain stepped forward, he didn't just move a decimal point, he moved a mountain of tradition. For over a century, the narrative surrounding the Sahel was one of the resource curse, a convenient academic term used to explain why African gold made everyone wealthy except Africans. It suggested that poverty was an inherent property of the soil, rather than a result of the contracts written upon it. But Ibrahim Traore flipped the script. He began to speak of a resource cure. He looked at the world and asked, if the gold belongs to the earth and the earth belongs to our fathers, why is the profit calculated in a language we are not meant to speak? This was the pivot. This was the moment the silence of the oppressed was replaced by the eloquence of the sovereign. Before we reveal the next chapter, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of sovereignty you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this content speaks to your heart, consider becoming a member of the Sahel Doctrine. This is not a transaction. It is a commitment. Your support directly fuels our next documentary and our deeper investigations into the truths that mainstream media often ignores. Every member helps us tell these stories with the depth, integrity, and honor they deserve. Join us. Be a part of what we are building and stand with the principle that African wealth belongs rightfully and forever to Africa. The pressure following this declaration was immense. The whispers in the corridors of international power began to sharpen into threats. They spoke of investor confidence, as if it were a fragile glass ornament that the Sahel was about to shatter. They warned that if Burkina Faso took 40%, the capital would flee, the machines would rust, and the nation would be left in the dark. It was a psychological war, an attempt to gaslight a nation into believing that its only path to survival was through its own exploitation. But the leadership in Ouagadougou remained unmoved. They understood that the confidence the West spoke of was merely the confidence to profit without resistance. Ibrahim Traore's response was not one of anger, but of cold, hard logic. He knew that the gold wasn't going anywhere. It was physically there, beneath the red earth. He knew that as long as the gold remained, the world would eventually come to terms with the new reality of African resource sovereignty. In the interviews that followed, the ones that Australia and the broader West were truly not ready for, Traore didn't sound like a rebel. He sounded like a chairman of the board reclaiming a stolen company. He spoke of the Sahel gold revolution not as a radical upheaval, but as a necessary correction. He pointed out the hypocrisy of a global system that preaches the sanctity of property rights while historical African property was being drained through one-sided agreements. The Western experts, with their tailored suits and complex spreadsheets, found themselves unable to answer his most basic questions. They were prepared to debate economics, they were not prepared to debate justice. This is where the countercurrents began to stir. Media outlets began to label the move as nationalism, a word often used as a slur when applied to the global South, but celebrated as patriotism when practiced in the North. They tried to paint a picture of chaos, yet the Mo-Kiaka continued its steady rhythm. The workers, many of whom were sons of the soil, saw their labor through a new lens. They were no longer just digging for a foreign paycheck. They were digging for the foundations of a new Burkina Faso. The contrast was stark. The Western world saw a risky asset, while the African diaspora saw a rising sun. But the empire does not retreat quietly. As the state's stake increased, a new kind of shadow war began. It wasn't fought with soldiers, but with sanctions, credit ratings, and diplomatic isolation. The goal was to make Burkina Faso an example, to show any other nation dreaming of dignity and liberation that the price of pride was too high to pay. They wanted to prove that an African nation could not stand on its own 2 feet without the crutch of Western capital. They waited for the young captain to blink. They waited for the economy to buckle under the weight of its own ambition. Yet, something unexpected happened. The experts had calculated the numbers, but they had failed to calculate the soul of a people who had reached their breaking point. They had ignored the drumbeat of history that was now echoing from the Sahel to Harlem, from Ouagadougou to the Caribbean. The pivot was complete. Burkina Faso had crossed the Rubicon, and there was no turning back. The question was no longer whether the West would allow this change, but how many other nations were currently sharpening their pens to follow suit. Because in the silence of the night, the other resource-rich nations of the continent were watching. They were watching to see if the young captain could hold the line. or if the weight of the world would finally crush the last candle of hope in the Sahel. And that is when the most dangerous move of all was played, a move that aimed not at the gold but at the very heart of the man leading the charge. To understand the weight of this moment, we must look beyond the uniform and into the soul of the movement. Ibrahim Traore is not merely a man. He is a manifestation of a century of unheard prayers. He represents a generation that has grown tired of being a footnote in someone else's economic textbook. For decades, the Sahel was viewed by the world as a place of lack, a place of intervention, a place where history happened to people rather than by them. But the young captain represents a clean break from the paternalism of the past. He speaks with the clarity of someone who has seen the bottom of the gold mines and the height of the ivory towers, and decided that the distance between them is a crime. This shift toward African resource sovereignty is not about isolation. It is about standing on one's own 2 feet. It is about the radical idea that the people of Burkina Faso should be the primary beneficiaries of the riches that lie beneath their ancestral graves. This is the internal engine of the Sahel gold revolution. It is powered by a quiet, fierce pride that refuses to be bought. When the government increased its stake in the Kiaka mine, they weren't just looking for a payout, they were looking for a future. They were building a system where the all-in sustaining costs of roughly $1,900 per ounce aren't just figures on a spreadsheet in Sydney, they are the boundaries of a nation's survival. By reclaiming 40% of the asset, they are ensuring that when the global price of gold rises, the prosperity of the village rises with it. It is a mathematical pursuit of dignity and liberation. Take a second right here to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet. The Sahel Doctrine sends you not just thanks, but a blessing, for strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, and for light on the road ahead. Whether you are in the heart of Atlanta, the streets of London, or the red earth of the continent itself, know that your presence here makes this map of connection stronger. Let the comments below be not just words, but bridges of solidarity across the diaspora. But let us be clear, this path is not paved with ease. There is a price to be paid for such a bold assertion of independence. In the world of high finance and global politics, stability is often a code word for compliance. When a nation decides to rewrite the rules of its own resources, the system pushes back. We see it in the subtle shifts of credit ratings, the sudden cooling of diplomatic ties, and the cautionary tales spun by international analysts. They warn of a chilling effect on investment. They suggest that by wanting more for its people, Burkina Faso is making itself a pariah. But the young captain's administration has stayed the course with a stoicism that is truly inspiring. They understand that the risk everyone talks about is often just the risk of a corporation making a slightly smaller profit so that a nation can build a slightly better school. This is the silent war of the 21st century. It is not fought with artillery, but with the quiet resilience of a people who have decided that they would rather eat the dust of their own land in freedom than feast on the crumbs of a foreign table in servitude. The operational reality of the mines remains stable. The engineers are still there, the logistics continue. The gold is still being refined. This proves that African excellence is not dependent on foreign permission. The system works because the people work. The tragedy of the past was not a lack of capacity, but a lack of ownership. For the elders of the African diaspora who remember the struggles of the 60s and 70s, this feels like a familiar song played on a new instrument. It is the same quest for justice, but with a sharper focus on the economic chains that survived the end of physical colonialism. Ibrahim Traore is operating in a world that is far more interconnected and far more digital, yet the stakes remain the same: the soul of a continent. Every ounce of gold that stays in the Sahel is a victory for Black history in the making. It is a seed planted for a harvest that our grandchildren will reap. However, as the dust settles on this latest move, the global empire is not simply going to walk away. They are regrouping, looking for the cracks in the armor, waiting for the moment when the pressure of the world becomes too much for a single nation to bear. They are betting on the idea that the Sahel cannot survive without their approval. But they have forgotten one thing. A fire that has been suppressed for a century does not go out just because the wind blows harder. It only grows. And as the sun begins to set over the Kiaka mine, casting long golden shadows across the red earth, a new and even more challenging reality is starting to emerge on the horizon. A reality that will test not just the government's resolve, but the very unity of the Sahel itself. What remains after the markets have settled and the headlines have faded is a stark and beautiful truth. The system did not break. The gears of the Kiaka mine continue to turn. The ore is still crushed, and the gold is still poured. But the spirit of the machine has been altered. For too long, the world was told that if an African nation dared to touch the steering wheel of its own economy, the vehicle would crash. We were told that we lacked the discipline, the expertise, and the stability to manage our own inheritance. Yet, in the Sahel, the lights have stayed on. The extraction continues with the same cold engineering precision as before. This proves that the operational structure and the ownership structure are not the same thing. One is a matter of science. The other is a matter of justice. By decoupling the two, the young captain has shown that a nation can be a partner without being a servant. The real advantage of this move is not found in a single budget cycle. It is found in the long-term positioning of a people. When you hold 40% of a producing asset, you are no longer just collecting a tax. You are participating in the creation of value. Each production cycle that follows adds to a national reservoir of leverage. This leverage can be used to build the schools that were once just dreams, to pave the dust roads into corridors of commerce, and to ensure that the wealth of the land is finally reflected in the lives of those who walk upon it. This is how a nation moves from income to wealth. This is how a people moves from survival to legacy. It is the slow compounding weight of pride. As we prepare to end, remember, this is not the end of the road, but a seed planted in the soil of your heart. Every story of dignity, every voice of sovereignty is part of a harvest that lies ahead. If you want to see that harvest grow, subscribe to our channel, the Sahel Doctrine. Let this channel be the road we walk together, the light we carry forward. Your subscription is not for us alone. It is for the promise of what is still to come. Join us and be ready for the next chapter that is already waiting to be written. This journey towards African resource sovereignty is a beacon for the entire continent. It sends a message to every capital from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The days of the one-sided contract are over. We are entering an era where the terms of engagement will be written in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, and in Niamey. It is the first true harvest of the Sahel Gold Revolution, a movement that is proving that the resource curse was only ever a lack of courage. The young captain, Ibrahim Traore, did not just increase a stake in a gold mine. He increased the stake of every African child in their own future. He has shown that the Red Earth is not just a place of struggle, but a foundation of power. To the African diaspora watching from across the seas, let this be a reminder of your own strength. The blood that flows through the Sahel is the same blood that built empires and survived the unthinkable. When we see Burkina Faso standing tall, we see a reflection of our own potential. We see a world where our history is no longer a story of what was taken from us, but a chronicle of what we have reclaimed. The road ahead will still be dusty, and the silent war for economic freedom is far from over. But the sun has risen too high for the shadows to return. The question is no longer how many minds will be restructured, but how many hearts have already been awakened. For once, a man knows the taste of sovereignty. He can never go back to the crumbs of dependency. Through African resource sovereignty, the children of the Sahel will finally inherit the earth they have so long labored upon. The drum is beating, the fire is lit, and the lion of the Sahel is no longer whispering. It is time for the world to listen.